First, a point that I am from a higher education system, and maybe my comments will be more directed towards the higher education system. I just tell you I have 3 or 4 points to make, and probably it will elicit questions after that. Reforms in education. What is reform? At what level these reforms are done? We do reforms. Do we do reforms in the academic philosophy of the things? Do we do reforms in the process of running the education system? We do reforms in the academic philosophy that we are following for the education system? Or we do reforms of what the education is supposed to do to meet the requirements of the country in terms of growth, in terms of conditions of the society, in terms of requirements for the society. I think these are the questions that come in reforms form. We do reforms, every country does reforms at the country level and gives policies for the country to follow for the next 15, 20 years or something like this. And we do practice reforms at different levels by different institutions, NGOs, individuals, and try to do experiments in different components of the educations and try to prove the validity of these reforms. But unfortunately, one thing is very true, that most of these experiments remain as experiments and don't go into a mass movement, to change the overall structure of education in any country. They remain as an experiment, and they're a very successful experiment, that is for sure. But will they convert the whole thing of the problem that we are trying to solve by education is not known. I don't have any mathematical model to simulate the effect of these reforms on the overall setups. And when I don't have this, the impact of a reform on the country or on the bigger systems is very difficult to assess, and therefore there is always that fear factor of changing the system into that particular point. The second point that I wanted to make was that in our country, Dr. Kori sir talked about the different processes of reforms that have gone on for the last 70 years. And we have gone through these policies about 4-5 times in this 70 years, change in the policy. And right now we are debating the new education policy. The point that I wanted to make was that the country as a whole, the moment of inertia is very big. The money requirements are very huge. And the education is a concurrent subject between the state and the center. And all these make the implementation and the doing of reforms in our education system much more difficult than many other countries. The third point that I wanted to make was every educationist will probably think and will probably come to the conclusion that education has many what I call as dichotomic things in the mind, and any education reforms have to take care of these dichotomies and take the right path. Just to give an example of the dichotomies that we have in the system, quantity versus quality. This is one big dimension of the dichotomy that we have, that we want to increase the GER on one side, increase the quantity of the people coming into the higher education system, and at the same time, I want the quality in the education system. And where do I take the path? Where does these institutions or the country take the path towards the quality side or towards the quantity side? I think this question has a big impact on the education policy that we make. The other question of the dichotomy is the equity versus excellence. And what do? Do I move towards the equity of the social systems and try to provide education to all? or we drive towards excellence of this system, excellence of this system. And these two require completely opposite solutions, and therefore it is very difficult for us to choose a common path. The dichotomy of price versus cost of education, the price and cost of education. Cost of education is something, price of education is something different. Every government, every institution tackles this issue of the cost of education and the price of the education. Another thing is public versus private. Do I need the public education or the private education, or the public money supporting the private education as a mixed PPP model? Or what is the solution for these education systems in the form of processes and systems to develop, We will have the issues of the definition of education itself, of prepare versus repair. Education is for livelihood or education is for knowledge. And I don't know what steps the government takes in taking these education reforms. Is it for the knowledge purpose, or is it for the purpose of earning a livelihood after the education? The issues that come in this dichotomic nature of educational reforms forming are very critical. And I think the mindset required for doing these reforms in education will need to have the balance of these two dichotomic situations. The last point that I wanted to talk about is, if I want to do a reform, the impact of the reforms are felt over a very long time, 15, 20 years. It is not very immediate. The impacts are not very immediate. And if I have to do reforms today in education, I have to have some semblance of what the education or what the scenario would be in 2040 or 2050 for me to undertake some reforms today. Or what is 2040 in higher education? What will be that situation? And that is a very difficult thing to predict in this changing world, the accelerating world of today, the accelerating world of technology, the accelerating world of change in the environment, and the accelerating world of the change of globalization that is happening in the world. It's very difficult for us to imagine or visualize what is education in 2040 and what change that I do, what reform that I do today in this condition. For me, I just want to paint one or two scenarios that come to my mind of this education in 2040 or 2050. Will it be that in 2050, when the age of singularity is done, and we are moved beyond the point of singularity of artificial intelligence taking over the human intelligence by 2030 or 2032, as it is predicted today, will it be that a robo will be teaching the students and not a teacher teaching the student, because it is only passing of information rather than knowledge, Will this robo will be popular because he doesn't punish the student? Will this robo also assess the grasping of the information being transferred by the students and then assessing it and then probably modifying his way of teaching to every individual student? Will it be that type of education? What will be the type of student sitting on the other side? This is on this side of the teacher. What may be the type of student sitting on the other side? The expansion in the genetic technology and in the biotechnology that is happening, will it be a super child sitting on the other side? Because the biology is moving at such a pace that the child will become a super child and it will be a designer child that I'll be sitting on the other side. Will it be a robot teaching that type of child on the other side? And what will it be? What will it teach? And how will it teach? This is one scenario that we should be prepared. A second, more simplistic scenario, if I have to say a more 3 to 5 year scenario, if you were to take, students in higher education, especially engineering, were coming with the clerk's table to their class, and then they started bringing the slide rule to the class, and then they started bringing the laptop to the class now. And that is the change that has happened in the education, the tools of education that the students bring. And maybe another 3 years, the students will come to the class with a smart device, whatever type of smart device it is, and a 3D printer, small 3D printer with him. And this will require a whole range of change in the reforms in the education system, starting from the curricula to the passing of the information and to the impact of the education. To me, another scenario which comes is probably the information availability which is there at this point of time will be there at that point of time much, much more. And information transfer will not be education. Information transfer will not be education because the word expert will be gone from the world. There is nobody expert. Everybody is an expert because of the information availability at the tips of everybody. There is no expert word. There is no complexity left in the world because the technology solves the complexity. And if that is the situation, if it is not for information transfer, the education, education is for what? Education is for what? Education is for a different purpose. And therefore, we may have to define new rules of what I need the education to do for the future, and new rules to be defined for the education in the future. And probably, it will be more of the way of learning rather than the learning itself, which we may have to define in the future, It may be the education systems would, just 1 minute, education system will call more of managing of the campuses and managing of the process and managing of the groups at the campuses, which will become much more requirement than the management of information transfer in the education system. That is another possibility to look at. And that will be a possibility that we'll have to think about in managing the campuses. How do I manage the campuses? Will the campus will become only a holiday place for the students to go and get the air of the university campus and get the degree and not have any technology transfer or any information transfer to this? The last point, maybe the future is about the lifelong learning and how do I provide these lifelong learning scenarios in the education and the reforms for the lifelong learning. How do I do this reform? How do I see the education system for people coming back into the education systems over their lifetime? The lifetime will be 120, 130, 140 years. And how do people come back to the education system and how do they get this education? A farmer trying to become and learning about drone technology in the future, and after the drone technology and he uses that technology, goes back to satellite imaging and then try to do that. What will be the type of lifelong learning that the education system would require? So that will be the thing. So I just painted some scenarios of the future and which the reforms should be undertaking at this point of time. Thank you very much.